Well, thank you all for coming. Yeah, Keenan called me up a while back and said, you know, you've been suggested as a speaker, and we want to hear about structural soils. And I said, well, okay, I can do 5 or 10 minutes on structural soils, because unless you really want to get into the nitty-gritty of how all the technical stuff of installing them and the contract, I don't do that part. But, I can talk about the value and, useful applications of them and such. So what I did is I broadened the talk out a bit to just planting trees in confined spaces. And it was Christine that came up with that title, which I said they're going to really expect a whole lot of drama out of my presentation on the basis of that title, and that's just not going to happen. So, but hopefully it will be informative. It's not a new picture, you can probably tell that, but do you have any idea where that is? I don't know if it's still there or not. The kid in the picture is now 31. It's on North Clark Street, somewhere around 2000 North Clark, something like that. I haven't gone back to look for it, but people see things like that and they go, roots, who needs roots? More than likely, that tree found a sewer or it found something. It's living off of something, but you can't tell what from there. So we'll go through a bit about why roots need space and how much space they need. This is a little thing. Every now and then we try to take all the soil off of a root system. That's not a very big tree. That's 2 inches might be stretching it in terms of the size of that tree. And you can see how far those roots spread. And the best I could do as far as superimposing a little 4x4 tree pit in the city is something along those lines, and that's only like a 2-inch tree. So if you imagine the tree gets bigger, the pit doesn't, okay? Or the tree you would like to get bigger and the pit doesn't. So it gives you a bit of a sense of perspective there. And what happens when trees don't have space for the root system. There's classic pictures like this all over the place. Those are another well-known botanic garden in the region that I can't mention its name. And those are actually fairly old too. Because the trees don't last that long. I'm sure they've been replaced maybe a couple of times since then out in the parking lots, but it does happen everywhere. But you can obviously see, you don't give the tree much space at all and it just struggles, and you give the tree a little bit more space and it does a whole lot better. So just how much space does a tree need? This, like so many other things I'm going to talk about tonight, doesn't have a really sound research and science database for it. The only 2 things I've ever found on this are these 2 charts. And this one actually is a Dutch colleague of mine put together from some Dutch literature that I don't understand. But I know Jitsa, and he's got a good scientific mind. I'm sure there's a fairly sound basis to it. This is one of Jim Urban's charts from a long time ago, which is probably more practical experience than research-based, because that's what Jim does, and we need them both. But I went and looked at this picture and tried to guesstimate the size of that tree and the amount of space that tree had, and sure enough, it followed those pretty well. A tree gets to, visually. Well, they use different scales, and I had to do some math to make sure they're pretty close. But this one's easier for me to read. So depending on the soil type, if you want a crown diameter of 12 meters, which is 12 times 3, 30-some feet, you've got to have a soil volume of about anywhere from, say, 50 to 80 or 90 cubic meters of soil. And I think, this is based on organic matter. It's kind of hard to read. I had to scale it down. But this is with higher organic matter, and that's with lower organic matter. And this one follows about the same thing. The units are different, but you just have to understand that the tree's only going to get as big as its root system can be. There's some, there's fudge factors in the whole thing, soil type, care, all that kind of thing. But the tree is going to be limited above ground by what it has available to it below ground, unless it finds a sewer, like in that elm tree along Clark Street. So then we can talk about, like I said, it started out with structural soil, but we talk about different ways to make more space available for roots. The first one's my favorite. It doesn't usually work. I won't say any more about it. We all know what that means. And I know that these landscape architects aren't often in control about how much space things have because you're working within a bigger scheme of things. But all those others are what we're going to spend a little time on. The shared space concept has been out there for a long time. And in fact, I was just reading something in Jim Urban's book where he thinks that the shared space concept will allow trees to get 20 to 30% bigger. I mean, you can see, I assume this is a little 4x4 or 6x6 tree pit over here. And as you get a similar, but maybe not exactly the same soil volume per tree, but combine it together, that the trees do better. But even those on the end don't do as well as those in the middle that can spread their roots out on either side. So, and in the forest, trees have relatively narrow crowns and their root systems pretty much intermingle with all their neighbors, and so they spread out and they share space. So, above ground and below ground, there's advantages. There's also some, you want to get picky, there's some other things in this picture. This is a little tree pit with a tree grate. Maybe there's some space under it, maybe there isn't. This is nice open space, that works well. So to me, it's really hard to distinguish the shared space from the open space, open soil concept, because open planters are the next, and it's hard for me to find shared root space and that's not an open planter. So, but none of this stuff has ever really got any scientific basis behind it. I mean, it's all observational. That's not a bad thing. But it's commonly accepted that 3 trees, each with 100 cubic feet of root space put together in a 300 cubic foot root space will actually do better than each one of those 3 separated out. Okay. One of these days, maybe we'll get ambitious and find a way to actually prove that. But it seems pretty common. The Michigan Avenue is kind of the classic example of open space planters on the street. They didn't surround them with pavement. Tom Perry, back in the day when he was the godfather of roots, used to just love to go down Michigan Avenue and look at those big trees along there and marvel at how big they grew in downtown Chicago, and attributed it to the open space that they had around them. And some of it's not as big as this one. But, there's other planters down in the city that, I've taken pictures of a couple. But again, it's an open planter, but it's also shared space, okay? I got lots of pictures of open planters, but they're still small trees. We got to wait 20 years to see how big they grow. Because when Daley was mayor, they did a lot of that kind of thing, but it's just going to take some time for those trees to grow and see whether a single tree in a smaller open planter will do just as well.
I'm a little bit confused with the open planter versus the shared space. What would an example of an open planter without shared space?
Just one of those trees instead of 3 of them together?
In a large.
Well, one tree in 1/3 of the planter. Okay. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there's plenty of those in the city, but they haven't been, yeah, as opposed to it being in the, all covered up. Okay. So, but most people think about putting root space below the pavement in one way or another. As far as I can tell, you got 2 choices. You can have the pavement, because, I should back up. Most of the time, there's crap under the pavement that's all compacted or at least not loosened before the pavement goes on. It's not very good at all space for roots. So if you want to put roots under pavement, you've got to do something to improve the space under that pavement. One of the approaches is to have the pavement be self-supporting so that the soil doesn't have to be compacted to support the pavement, because once the soil is compacted, it's not very good for root growth. The other approach is to define a soil mix which can support the pavement above, but also allow roots to grow into that soil. And most often those are rocky soil mixes, and structural soil is the generic term, which we'll talk about. And so we'll talk about both of those options, but we're going to hit the suspended pavement first. Not just because Bartlett is sponsoring this, but this is the Tree Research Laboratories out in Charlotte. And they've put some plots together where they've got different kinds of structural soils and just compacted soil and suspended pavements and such. And you can see there are two different species, don't mistake that, but there's different performance of the trees and the different kinds of soils that are underneath those pavements. And certainly the suspended pavement, where there's just good soil under the pavement with the pavement bridged over it, do the best of as good or better than any of the other kind of treatments. I don't know, you guys, how many of these plastic structures, I don't know what they call these things. I don't know what the generic term for them is. The one I know of from the States, was it Deep Root, I think, that does the Silva cells, they call them. But these other ones I keep running into over in Europe and things like that, which are same concept. It's just different plastic structures that stack on top of each other so that you can put good soil inside of it, and then you can put the pavement on top of it to be supported by the structure. In theory, I guess it's easier and less expensive than building an elaborate system like, Pennsylvania, I'll show a picture in a minute, but on Pennsylvania Avenue in DC years ago, they actually built all up and down the streets a suspended pavement with loose soil and irrigation. A really nice system for trees underneath. This is the modern, easier version, they say, but I hear it's still not very cheap. And there's maybe more on the market by now that I don't even know about. But the concept is good. You've got something supporting the pavement with a lot of good soil underneath for the roots to grow in. This is Pennsylvania Avenue. And this is back, I think, a 1980 picture. And Jim Patterson was much better at telling the story of how this all got started. But somehow, some garden club or some group decided they need to do a better job on Pennsylvania Avenue. So this sidewalk is all suspended on engineered structure. Okay? And so and it's irrigated and it's drained and everything underneath it. And it's good for trees, but even back then, look at the difference. It's not as good as just open soil, open space. The volume of space is about the same there and there, but just having it open to the atmosphere and water and air and everything that the soil needs, seems to be a whole lot better. So none of these, and I guess maybe that's my underlying message or overarching message for the whole day. All these other systems that you can try to design and come up with to give space for roots under pavements and everything else are probably never really going to measure up to just good old-fashioned open soil underneath the tree. But sometimes you have to do what you can do, and when you can't have the ideal. And there's those same trees, same exact spot actually, in like 2006, I think that was. And we'd be pretty happy if trees in a sidewalk lasted from sometime before 1980 to 2006 and still look pretty good, but look how much better those are doing. So, just you need to understand the benefits and the limitations of these different systems. And that's just an old picture from, but it's kind of to represent vaults, because I know Jim Urban in his book has kind of touts vaults a little bit, and most of what I see in those kind of pictures are actually fairly expensive looking, constructed on site kind of things. Whereas this was actually up in Lombard about 20 years ago or something, and they just kind of used precast sewer parts to create a vault for a tree pit. And it's better than nothing, but as I go through Lombard nowadays, I'm not seeing much evidence that it worked really well long-term. But the concept, again, is potentially good if you can figure out how to make it work.